welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first and only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott. I'm with Ludmila Yamalova. She's the managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm HPL Yamalova and Plethka, based here in Dubai. Ludmila, always great to see you.
Good to be here with you, Tim.
This episode of Lawgical, a light Lawgical, a shorter version perhaps, but it's all about wrongful eviction. And this is kind of an interesting one to me. I've been evicted as per the law. I've just been given a year's notice where I live, and I got the court eviction notice a few months ago. I just renewed my rent. My landlord apparently wants to sell the house, so he's within his rights. So it's not wrongful eviction. And in Dubai, where we are right now, if a landlord wrongfully evicts a tenant, it is the law, is it not, that a tenant can claim compensation from a landlord?
Correct.
Right.
So just by way of recap and reminder is that in terms of tenancy laws in the UAE, they're very much Emirate-based and Emirate-specific, which means that if we're talking about properties in Dubai, Dubai has its own rental laws. Other Emirates have their own rental laws. What we're talking about today is the Dubai rental laws and Dubai rental courts and jurisprudence. And as you rightfully pointed out, that in Dubai, evictions are subject to to very strict or conditional upon very strict terms, and are and otherwise are pretty have a pretty high burden of proof. And among other things, what we're talking about is that for a landlord to evict a tenant, there have to be specific terms or specific grounds for eviction. Yeah. We've covered this previously. We've done a number of podcasts on this topic, so we will not go into the kind of nitty-gritty details, but for the purposes of wrongful eviction for today's topic, what we want to focus on is those evictions, or where landlords evict their tenant on the representations of wanting to move it into the property themselves. So that is one of the valid grounds for eviction, because you cannot just evict the tenant because the contract ended. That's not the case in Dubai. Contracts here, lease contracts, automatically basically renew on the same terms and conditions, except, and there is a few exceptions. So one of the exceptions, if you can be evicted at the end of your tenancy, and if the landlord wants to move into the property, be it as a residential or as a commercial property. And if the landlord wants to move in and take possession of the property for their own use, then they have to give you 1 year notice. Yeah. And then the notice obviously has to be given in a certain form. And this is important because you mentioned that you were rightfully being rightfully evicted because you received that proper notice through the UAE notary, so the Dubai notary. Yep. And that clearly states, well, we want we want you to move out a year from now, because it'd be a 1 year notice. And in your case, it's because the landlord says that they want to sell, right? So that by law, that is the correct process, and therefore that would be a valid eviction notice. However, there is still a caveat that notice is only effective, and the reasons are only valid if they're true. So in other words, if the landlord truly actually wants to sell the property and ultimately sells the property. Not only wants to sell, but ultimately sells the property. And then another example is when the landlord wants to move into the property, and so they evict you for personal use. And so the law provides that in the event a tenant is evicted on one of those grounds, under the representation that either the landlord wants to sell the property or wants to move in themselves, and then they ultimately don't either sell or move in, and instead rent it out to someone else, then the tenant can seek compensation against that landlord, fair compensation. We'll come back and how the compensation is calculated shortly. But so this is an important topic, especially now, because as we know, the Dubai property market is booming again, and it's very hot, and the prices are going up exponentially and quite rapidly, and what we're seeing is a trend now amongst property owners who are evicting tenants on representation. Either they want to sell the property or that they want to move in themselves. But in fact, for them, again, obviously there are real examples, but I would still say perhaps in many ways there are more exceptions than the rule. I think the majority of evictions that we're seeing, that we're hearing about, are done on, while they follow the kind of the correct protocol, but they're done on false assumptions or false representations. So the representations are as per the law, but ultimately the intentions are different. The landlord's intentions are different. They just want to evict the tenant, and so that then they can rent it out for a lot more money. And then after that, they figured, okay, well, yes, maybe the law provides a compensation, but who is ever going to pursue us? So there's also that. And I have to tell you, why we're seeing an upswing in cases like this is because landlords believe that a lot of their properties have gone up 100% in value, 50% in value. We just have a client now who's basically a businesses, they're clinics, and they're being the new owner of the property wants to evict them or actually first they said we want to evict because we want to demolish the property or reconstruct it, but then they said no, actually we want to increase, and then they wanted to increase by like 40%. They said, oh, actually no, we want to increase by 80%. I mean, so that just gives you a flavor of why we are seeing such an upswing in cases, is because property owners believe that judging from the rest of the real estate market, that their property values have gone up so much more. So that's why they are very active now and therefore actively evicting.
Actively, rightfully evicting or not. Well, let's take my example as the case for the purposes of this podcast. I mean, in theory, my landlord says I want to sell the house, therefore I'm going to evict you. Fine. I've received legally the correct notice. That's fine. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen. But, is it worth it, I'll move to somewhere else and then going to the rent disputes committee and making a case if it's not true? I mean, is it really worth bothering with?
Well, it really depends. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on how much you've been prejudiced. So if you moved out and you moved out to maybe a property that costs about the same or costs a little more, but maybe it's a better property, then as a matter of principle, for some people, it's a matter of principle. Sure. And they just want to do it as a matter of principle. Now, I always say that's not necessarily perhaps a pragmatic decision. It's more emotional. And I would not want, and I always advise my clients kind of against acting on their emotions, because it kind of gets exciting and at that point in time. But once you go through the process, you quickly run out of your steam, and then you regret your decision. So I don't think that's necessarily being emotional is necessarily the right decision. That being said, some people feel very committed to the cause, and they just feel very wrong. And for them, it's harder to sleep at night without having basically try to enforce their rights in court, even if their ultimate benefit is marginal.
I mean, the thing is, I've had 3 months to think about this now, and I will have had 12 months to think about it, and I will move. But if I do then find that I've been evicted wrongfully, I will make a case. That I can guarantee. And I'm not emotional about it. And I think that time frame, that 12 months time frame, certainly allows you to simmer down a little bit, doesn't it? You look at it differently.
For sure. But at the same time, when you are being uprooted and you have to move your whole family, it's quite an exercise, and it's a burden. It's an expense, and it's not just a financial burden, but it's also administrative challenge, right? Because if you have small kids and they go to school, perhaps you have a house that's close to your school. Maybe you selected that school because of the proximity to your house. Now you're being evicted, and in most cases, if you're being evicted, it's because the property, most likely the property values have gone up quite significantly in that area. Therefore, for you to move out, you'd have to move to a different area. Therefore, in many cases, farther away from the school. So it potentially has the effect of turning your whole life upside down. So the burden is really quite significant, and this is why we have the laws the way they're drafted, the way they are, exactly for that reason. Because otherwise, it can have the potential of creating quite significant chaos in society and in industry, and that's not healthy for the economy. So that's why the law is drafted the way it is, and that's why these remedies are provided for in the law. So now, would you want to do it? Would you want to pursue this because you're convinced that you've been wronged, that you want to pursue it? It could be an emotional decision. So that's one decision. The other decision is when you actually have to pay a lot more money to have similar accommodation or similar options, and then the other option is, or the other reason is that you basically maybe you weren't even able to find a similar option or an alternative, so you've had to kind of downgrade. So you're really upset, and maybe you're paying the same, but you feel like you've been wrong because you're living sort of a different lifestyle. So there's many reasons why you would want to do why you would want to do it. Now, the reasons aside, one of the kind of deterrents in the past maybe would have been, and this is why the owners would have acted the way they used to, is who's going to do it? Having to go to court, you have to hire lawyers, you have to go to court, submit documents, stand in line, wait for these hearings and so forth, which is how it used to be. So it's so if you're trying to get compensation of 20,000-30,000 dirhams, and then in the meantime, for you to represent, to do this case, you have to pay lawyers, you have to pay the court fees, you have to potentially use your own time to go to different hearings. And it's just, then you think, is it really worth it? Or should I just give up? Now that consideration perhaps is no more for the most part, because all of these cases can now be, but basically exclusively managed online. So because the jurisdiction or the authority that oversees or enforces rental disputes or addresses rental disputes is what's called the RDC, the Rental Dispute Center, which is the rental court. And the rental court RDC that sits under the umbrella of Dubai Land Department and RERA, it's entirely online. So the whole process in online, the proceedings online, you submit your complaint online. You don't ever have to leave home. You don't have to hire lawyers. You could do it all on your own. The only thing is that you do need to make your submissions in Arabic, and whatever documents you submit, they also have to be translated into Arabic. But these days, it's so much easier. You just send it to any legal translator to have it translated, and there's translation centers and typing centers which will draft the document for you in Arabic. So you could use Google Translate, because RDC, the Rental Dispute Center, is specialized for rental cases. Therefore, procedurally, it's not as formal as other courts would be, as perhaps more sort of mainstream courts are, the main courts are. So because it's informal, you truly can use just Google Translate. I mean, the court just wants to see the substance. It's a substance over form. So you don't need to leave the house. You don't need to hire a lawyer. You can truly do everything on your own. And the whole idea of this RDC, a specialized court, it's a lot more efficient and it moves a lot faster. So therefore, these days, that the previous deterrent of, oh my gosh, the headache of having to litigate this, and I'm not sure how it's going to be interpreted or adjudicated at the end, is less of a thing of the past. Because now the law is very specific. The law is very clear. Now the law is fairly old. It's from 2007. However, there's been a lot more jurisprudence that's enforcing and further reconfirming this law is quite robust. Yep. So that's why now people know the law is on their side, the jurisprudence on their side, the access to justice, i.e. the RDC, the court system is a lot more accessible, and financially it's a lot more accessible. Therefore, why not? So now these days, a lot more people actually not just would, but do actually file cases in these circumstances, and they do monitor the landlords pretty closely, and take them to court. I was going to say take them to task, but actually they take them to court. And so, in fact, why we wanted to talk about this topic today is, one, because this is what we're seeing. This is what's churning the market right now. There's so many eviction notices that are, and you were here, voila, there's a living example sitting in this room. So that's one. And two, because we're seeing a lot more judgments, a lot more jurisprudence coming out of RDC, reconfirming, reestablishing, sort of not really reestablishing, but more reconfirming this principle and reapplying this principle over and over and over again. And it's pretty clear that in the event your landlord re-rents your property after they evicted you, it's called a wrongful eviction. And in the event they re-rent it, then you can seek compensation, and it's called fair compensation. Now, how do you define fair compensation is a question. And so it depends on how you measure it. One way of doing it is, let's say if you move out of your house now, it's a 3-bedroom house, and you move to a different 3-bedroom house, and you now pay 30-40% rent. And by the way, by law, for residential property, the landlord cannot re-rent it for 2 years. Right, and for commercial properties for 3 years.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, you could seek compensation for those 2 years. So let's say now you used to pay 100,000, now you're paying 130,000. You can say request look for these 2 years, and I'm paying 30% more for each year, so it's 30,000 a year more. So you could claim 60,000, for example, compensation. That's one way to do it. The other way, because remember, for a lot of people, they just cannot afford. They move because they cannot pay more than 100,000. It's not necessarily the case that they're going to move to a similar place and pay a higher price. They may just actually downsize. And therefore pay the same 100,000. So how do you measure in that case? So then the way you could seek compensation then is you would use a comparable, right? So not your own case, but look, like I had to move into a 2-bedroom versus a 3-bedroom, because if I were to move into a 3-bedroom, I would have paid so much more. And so then you take basically the depreciation value, if you will. So you're living in a 2-bedroom, and it should have been a 3-bedroom. So basically it's the same kind of, ultimately the same amount you'd probably come up with. Although I'm paying the same amount, but I would have, if I had been renting a similar property, I would have been paying 30% more, for example.
And that's a relatively easy comparison to make, because there are so many of these cases, and there have been historically a number of these cases. So comparisons and precedents there.
For sure. And that's so there's different, yes, absolutely. And then there's, on top of that, there's other examples. And also in the court, we've seen them being enforced as, for example, just the moving costs. That's also a cost, right? Yeah. You can add that to. And sometimes people had to move into hotels. So you can actually also present your actual expenses that you had to pay as a result of this wrongful eviction. So, for example, maybe you needed to move to a hotel for a while until you found you were able to move into your new property. Maybe you had to put moving expenses. Maybe you had to pay for maintenance team. Maybe you had to pay for painting of your new place and some sort of updates to the place, because so you could, if there are actual expenses that you've incurred as part of this, again, part of this move, you can also present them to the court to argue that this is part of your sort of damages, your losses, because of this wrongful eviction. And the courts are, the principle is very well settled, and they recite the same provisions from this law, which is Dubai Law number 26 of 2007, which regulating landlord-tenant relationships, and which was later amended in 2008, and it became kind of law number 33. So these are basically the laws that RDC cites, and in particular Article 25. And so that principle is very well established. So there isn't really much for debate. It's more about how you prove. You have to prove two things. One is that the landlord actually re-rented the property, right? And two, so you have to quantify the extent of your damages or losses.
Okay, so you can quantify the extent of your damages or losses. What proof do you need to show that your landlord has re-rented a villa or an apartment? Because, any villa or apartment residential space is legally required to be documented anyway. So surely the proof is already there.
Right. And so this is another interesting angle, is that, one way to prove it is, let's say you know who the new tenants are. You just ask them for a copy of the tenancy agreement. And that's obviously it's not confidential, because they're the ones who gave you this agreement, and they are the party to this agreement, so they have full right to give it to you.
Okay.
So that's one way of doing it. The other way is because RDC sits under what I said earlier, DLD and RERA, and also the service that's used to register all the rental agreements, called a JARI. basically there's also a relationship between DLD and RERA and RDC and the JARI. So you could actually request for the court, for RDC, to make a request to the JARI, so that the JARI provides the current tenancy agreement for that particular property.
Right.
In other words, it's like a disclosure, but the court will request a particular authority, please provide me with this document. So that's another way of doing it, and that's a common way of requesting documents as part of the court case.
And can you go ahead on that basis if you feel like your landlord has, wrongfully evicted you and you feel as though he has re-rented it? Could you make a case based on the fact that you think that's happened and request for that ijari, that rental kind of confirmation? Is that
a good question? Yes, you can.
Okay.
And so if you obviously should be sure that there is a tenancy agreement, because otherwise you will not be able to prove the main point. But so if you have a pretty strong feeling about it, yes, you can file just case. Listen, I know that they're renting, and so I want because you may actually even have somehow a copy of the rental agreement, but you didn't receive it necessarily in kind of the most legitimate way. Yeah. So you may not want to use it in the proceedings, but you know for a fact that it exists. Yeah. So in that case, even if you have a copy of it, it may be more advisable to actually request, or RDC to request this document from a JARI, and so that you have sort of proof of having received it legitimately.
Okay. It's all good to know. What else do we need to know about wrongful evictions? Is there anything that we've missed?
Well, I just think that just going to recap is all tenants should be aware that the law is there. The law is very well settled. There is there's profound and prolific jurisprudence reconfirming the same principle, and so the law is on tenants' side. But they just, if they believe that they are being kind of bullied or toyed with, they certainly they should not be afraid to enforce their rights under the law. And there are ways of obtaining this information to prove your point, as we discussed. And because of the accessibility of the judicial system and the ability to argue and present your case without having to necessarily spend significant amounts on lawyers and court fees and translations, you can so much of this you can manage on your own. It certainly is a worthy exercise that is very accessible to majority of people. And by the way, most of the people, a lot of people actually are making these kinds of claims, and a lot of these claims are managed by tenants themselves without really sort of much involvement from lawyers. So the courts are used to them. And these decisions are being issued in many cases just on the back of people representing themselves. So there's nothing to be afraid of, and certainly the law is on their side. And if you think it's a significant or important enough issue for you, then don't be afraid to try to stand up for yourself and argue your rights in court.
That's Lawgical, this time wrongful evictions, specifically here in Dubai. As always, thank you for watching, listening, or both. Thanks to our legal expert, managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethcote, Ludmila Yamalova. It's always a learning experience with you, Ludmila. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
You can find us at LY Law on social media, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. The podcasts that we produce are free at lylawyers.com and on your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like a legal question answered in an episode of Lawgical, or if you want to talk to a qualified UE experienced legal professional, click contact at lylawyers.com.